The old car coughed and sputtered as it rolled into the parking lot of Westbrook Academy. David gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, silently praying that it wouldn't give up on him. Not tonight. Not when his daughter needed him here. The engine rattled one last time before finally going quiet, and he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He sat there for a moment, looking at the beautiful brick building in front of him. The Performing Arts Center was gorgeous with its tall windows and fancy entrance. Parents were already walking in, dressed in suits and elegant dresses. David glanced down at his own clothes. He'd changed out of his work uniform in the staff bathroom at the office building he cleaned, but his shirt was wrinkled and his pants had seen better days. Still, they were clean. That's what mattered, right? His daughter Sophie was inside, probably nervous and excited at the same time. Tonight was her first solo performance at the piano recital. She'd been practicing for months, her little fingers moving over the keys every evening when he got home from his second job. Sometimes he'd fall asleep on the couch listening to her play, exhausted from the long day, but always so proud of how dedicated she was. David checked himself in the rearview mirror one more time, running his hand through his hair. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. That's when he heard the engine, a smooth, powerful purr that sounded like money itself. A sleek black luxury car pulled into the spot right next to his beat-up Honda. The contrast was almost painful. His car looked like it had been through a war, with its faded paint and dented bumper. The new arrival looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. The driver's door opened and out stepped a man in an expensive suit. Everything about him screamed wealth, from his polished shoes to his perfectly styled hair. This was Richard Thornton, the CEO of Thornton Industries. David recognized him because he cleaned the executive offices in the building where Thornton had his headquarters. They'd never actually spoken, though. Guys like Thornton didn't notice guys like David. Thornton's eyes landed on David's car immediately and something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe. Or was it disgust? The man's mouth curved into a smirk as he looked from the car to David. Well, well, Thornton said loudly, his voice carrying across the parking lot. That thing actually made it here? I'm genuinely surprised. David felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. Other parents were getting out of their cars now, and some of them were starting to look over. Thornton's wife emerged from the passenger side, dressed in what was probably a designer outfit that cost more than David made in 3 months. Honey, look at this, Thornton called to his wife, gesturing at David's car like it was a museum exhibit. I didn't know they still made cars that looked like this. Or maybe it's just been driven into the ground. A few people actually laughed. David felt heat rising to his face, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd dealt with worse. He could handle this. It runs just fine, David said quietly, closing his door and pressing the lock button. The lock made a grinding sound that seemed extra loud in the awkward silence. Barely from the sound of it, Thornton shot back, still grinning. I mean, seriously, that engine sounds like it's about to explode. Aren't you worried about breaking down with your kid in the car? David's jaw clenched. Now he was bringing Sophie into this. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. We manage okay. Manage, Thornton repeated like the word was funny. That's one way to put it. You know, they have these things called trade-ins. You could probably get at least a few $100 for that heap, though honestly, they might charge you to haul it away. More laughs from the gathering crowd. David noticed a woman in pearls whisper something to her husband, both of them looking at him with barely concealed pity. Or maybe it was judgment. Hard to tell sometimes. Thornton walked around David's car, actually inspecting it like a judge at a car show. Look at this rust. And is that duct tape holding your side mirror on? Classic. He turned to face David directly. Let me guess what you do for a living. Wait, don't tell me. I actually know already. You're the janitor at Henderson Building downtown, aren't you? David's blood ran cold. So Thornton had noticed him after all. Just not in the way anyone wants to be noticed. I work there, yes, David said simply. Right. The night shift janitor. Thornton nodded like he'd just solved a puzzle. That explains a lot. The car, the clothes, everything. You know, if you spent less time doing whatever janitors do and more time working on your career, maybe you could afford something better. For your kid's sake, you know? Kids notice these things. Must be embarrassing for her. That hit harder than anything else. David felt something crack inside his chest. Embarrassing for Sophie? His sweet, talented daughter who never complained about anything? Who wore hand-me-down clothes and ate packed lunches while other kids bought from the cafeteria? Who practiced piano on the old keyboard he'd bought secondhand because he couldn't afford a real piano? My daughter isn't embarrassed, David said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. Sure, sure, Thornton said, waving a hand dismissively. That's what they all say. But come on, look around. Look at where we are. This is Westbrook Academy. You know what it costs to send a kid here? And you're pulling up in that thing wearing janitor clothes. The other kids must give her a hard time. David wanted to say so much. He wanted to tell this arrogant man that he worked 3 jobs to afford Westbrook Academy, that he was up at 5 every morning to clean offices before his construction job started at 9, that he worked until 8 at night, then came home to help Sophie with homework and listen to her practice piano, that every single penny he made went to keeping a roof over their heads and keeping Sophie in this school, because her music teacher said she had real talent, the kind of talent that shouldn't be wasted. He wanted to tell Thornton that Sophie's mother had died 2 years ago, and that he was doing his absolute best to be both parents to their little girl. That some nights he fell asleep at the kitchen table exhausted beyond words, but he always made sure Sophie had everything she needed. He wanted to say all of that, but he didn't. Because what was the point? Men like Richard Thornton didn't care about stories like his. They saw what they wanted to see, and right now they saw a failure in a parking lot. We should get inside, David said instead, his voice flat. The recital's about to start. Right, Thornton said, already losing interest. Wouldn't want to miss the show. Though between you and me, these things are usually pretty boring. My daughter's performing tonight, too. She's been taking lessons since she was 4. We got her the best teacher money can buy. Of course he did, David thought. They walked toward the building, Thornton and his wife striding ahead with their heads high, while David followed a few steps behind. He could still hear people whispering, still feel their eyes on him. But he kept walking, kept his head up, because inside that building his daughter was waiting, his brilliant, beautiful daughter who had worked so hard for this moment. As they entered the lobby, David caught a glimpse of himself in one of the decorative mirrors on the wall. He did look tired. He did look worn down. His clothes were shabby compared to everyone else's, but when he thought about Sophie, about the way her face lit up when she played piano, none of that mattered. He found a seat in the back of the auditorium, letting the wealthy parents fill up the front rows. That was fine by him. He could see perfectly well from back here. Thornton and his family settled into premium seats in the very first row, right in the center. The lights dimmed and David's heart started beating faster. Somewhere backstage, Sophie was probably taking deep breaths, the way he'd taught her to do when she was nervous. He wished he could be back there with her, telling her she was going to do great, that he was proud of her no matter what happened. The recital was about to begin, and David had no idea that in the next hour, everything was going to change. Not just for him and Sophie, but for Richard Thornton too. Sometimes life has a funny way of teaching people lessons when they least expect it. The curtain started to rise, and David leaned forward in his seat, ready to watch his daughter shine. The auditorium fell quiet as the first student walked onto the stage. David watched from his seat in the back, his hands gripping the armrests. The young boy sat at the grand piano and began playing something classical. It was nice enough, but David could tell the kid was nervous. A few wrong notes here and there, some hesitation. Still, the parents clapped politely when he finished. One by one, the students performed. Some were better than others. Some froze up and had to start over. David felt for every single one of them. He knew how scary it was to perform in front of a crowd. He'd done it himself a lifetime ago, though that felt like a different person now. Then came Richard Thornton's daughter. Victoria walked onto the stage with confidence, her dress probably costing more than David's monthly rent. She settled at the piano and launched into a Beethoven piece. Her playing was technically correct. Every note was precise, every timing exact. But something was missing. It was like watching a robot play piano, perfect but cold, no feeling behind it. Still, when she finished, the applause was enthusiastic. Thornton stood up, clapping loudly and beaming with pride. His wife was recording the whole thing on her phone. David noticed other parents congratulating them even before Victoria left the stage. More students performed. The program was running long, and David could see some parents checking their watches or phones. A few were whispering to each other, probably about work or plans after the recital. The excitement from the beginning had worn off. Then the music teacher walked to the center of the stage. Mrs. Chen was a kind woman in her 60s who'd been teaching piano for longer than David had been alive. She'd been the one to recognize Sophie's talent, the one who'd convinced David to keep her enrolled even when money got really tight. "Our final performer tonight is Sophie Williams," Mrs. Chen announced, and David's heart jumped into his throat. "She'll be playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major." David watched his daughter walk onto that stage, and his eyes immediately filled with tears. She looked so small up there, so vulnerable. Her dress was one they'd found at a thrift store 3 months ago. He'd spent an evening learning how to sew on YouTube, just so he could fix a tear in the hem. It wasn't fancy like the other girls' dresses, but Sophie had loved it because it was blue, her favorite color. She sat at the piano bench, adjusting it slightly. From where David sat, he could see her hands trembling a little. She looked out into the audience, and even though the lights were probably making it hard to see, David waved slightly. He hoped she could sense him there, cheering her on. Sophie placed her hands on the keys. The auditorium was still buzzing with quiet conversation. A few people were still on their phones. Nobody seemed particularly interested in this final performance. They were probably all ready to go home. Then Sophie started playing. The first notes floated through the air like whispers, soft and delicate. David had heard her practice this piece 100 times at home on their little keyboard, but this was different. This was a real grand piano, and in Sophie's hands it sounded like magic. The conversations in the audience didn't stop right away. But slowly, one by one, people began to notice something special was happening on that stage. Heads turned. Phones were lowered. The whispers faded away. Sophie's small hands moved across the keys with impossible grace. This wasn't just technical skill. This was emotion pouring out through music. Every note seemed to carry weight, meaning the sad parts made your chest ache. The hopeful parts made you want to smile. It was like she was telling a story without words. David wasn't the only one crying now. He could see other parents wiping their eyes. Even some of the kids who'd performed earlier were watching with their mouths open. The whole room had gone completely silent except for the music. This was the piece David used to play back when he was young and full of dreams. Back when everyone said he was going to be famous one day. He'd taught Sophie the basics when she was tiny, showing her how to find middle C, how to read simple sheet music. But what she was doing now had gone far beyond anything he'd taught her. This was pure talent, the kind you can't learn or fake. In the front row, even Richard Thornton had stopped smiling his smug smile. He was staring at the stage with an expression David couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. Like he couldn't understand how this was possible. Sophie reached the climax of the piece, her fingers dancing across the keys with increasing intensity. The music swelled and filled every corner of the auditorium. It was powerful and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Then gradually it softened again, winding down to those final gentle notes. When the last note faded into silence, nobody moved, nobody breathed. For what felt like forever, the whole room just sat there, stunned. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then everyone was on their feet, applauding like crazy. It wasn't the polite clapping from earlier. This was genuine, enthusiastic, amazed applause. People were cheering. Some were still wiping tears from their eyes. David stood too, clapping so hard his hands hurt. His face was wet with tears, but he didn't care. That was his daughter up there. His little girl who'd lost her mother and never once complained, who practiced every single day even when she was tired, who sometimes fell asleep with sheet music in her lap. Sophie stood and took a small bow, her face flushed with happiness and relief. She looked toward the back of the auditorium, and David knew she was looking for him. He waved both arms now, not caring what anyone thought. "That's my girl," he said, though nobody could hear him over the applause. As Sophie walked off the stage, Mrs. Chen returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our recital. Please join us in the lobby for refreshments." But nobody was moving. They were all still talking about Sophie's performance. David made his way toward the lobby, wanting to find Sophie and give her the biggest hug of her life. But the crowd was thick, everyone moving slowly. He could hear snippets of conversation around him. Who was that girl? Absolutely incredible. I've never heard a child play like that. Someone should record her. She could be famous. David pushed through, trying to get to where the performers were gathering with their families. Finally, he spotted Sophie near the refreshment table, standing by herself and looking a bit lost in the crowd. Mrs. Chen was beside her, speaking animatedly with someone David couldn't see. "Sophie," David called out, and his daughter's face broke into the biggest smile. She ran to him and he scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around despite his aching back from a long day of work. "I did it, Dad," she said, laughing. "I didn't mess up." "You were perfect," David told her, setting her down but keeping his hands on her shoulders. "Better than perfect. You were amazing. Really? You're not just saying that? Really? I've never been more proud of anything in my entire life." Mrs. Chen approached them and David noticed she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, maybe in his 50s, wearing glasses and an expensive-looking jacket. He had the air of someone important, though David couldn't place him. "Mr. Williams," Mrs. Chen said, and her eyes were shining with excitement. "This is Jonathan Pierce. He's a music producer and documentary filmmaker. He was here tonight scouting talent for a project." David shook the man's hand, confused. "Nice to meet you." "Mr. Williams, your daughter is extraordinary," Jonathan said, getting straight to the point. "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've worked with some of the finest musicians in the world. What Sophie just did on that stage is the kind of raw talent you see maybe once in a decade, maybe less." David felt dizzy. "Thank you. She works very hard. I can tell. But this goes beyond hard work. This is a gift." Jonathan pulled out a business card. "I'm producing a documentary series about young musical prodigies and their journeys. I'd love to talk to you about featuring Sophie." Before David could respond, Richard Thornton appeared at his elbow. The CEO looked different now. The smugness was gone, replaced by something else. He wasn't sneering anymore. "Excuse me," Thornton said, though he was looking at Jonathan, not David. "Jonathan Pierce? I thought that was you." "Richard Thornton. We met at the charity gala last year." "Richard, yes, of course," Jonathan said politely. Thornton gestured toward David with a tight smile. "I see you've met the janitor from my building. His daughter did put on quite a show, I'll admit. Surprising, really, given the circumstances." David felt his stomach sink. Here it comes again. But before he could say anything, Jonathan's expression changed completely. The polite smile vanished, replaced by something cold. "The janitor from your building?" Jonathan repeated slowly. "This is David Williams." Thornton looked confused. "Yes, that's what I said. Do you have any idea who David Williams is?" Jonathan asked, and now other people were starting to gather around, sensing drama. Thornton shrugged. "He cleans offices. What else is there to know?" Jonathan looked at Thornton like he'd just said something incredibly stupid. Then he turned to David and his expression softened. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were trying to stay anonymous. But I think the truth needs to come out here." David's hands went cold. No, he thought. Please don't, but it was too late. Jonathan was already talking. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice carrying across the lobby, "let me tell you about David Williams. 20 years ago, he was one of the most promising young pianists in the country. He was being compared to the greats. He had a full scholarship to Juilliard. Critics were saying he could be the pianist of his generation." The lobby had gone quiet again. Everyone was staring now. Sophie looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Dad?" David wanted to disappear. He wanted to grab Sophie and run out of this building and never come back. But his feet wouldn't move. "I was working on a documentary about emerging classical talent back then," Jonathan continued. "I interviewed David. I heard him play. He was breathtaking. Everyone in the music world was watching him, waiting to see what he'd do next." Thornton's face had gone pale. "I don't understand." "Then David's mother got cancer," Jonathan said quietly. "And instead of going to Juilliard, instead of pursuing what would have been an incredible career, he stayed home to take care of her. He gave up everything. The scholarship, the opportunities, all of it. He worked whatever jobs he could find to pay for her treatment. For years." Mrs. Chen had tears running down her face now. Other parents were looking at David with new understanding and maybe shame for how they judged him earlier. "David Williams was a prodigy," Jonathan said. "Sophie didn't just inherit talent from somewhere random. She inherited it from a father who sacrificed his own dreams to take care of the people he loved." The silence in that lobby was deafening. David couldn't look at anyone. He especially couldn't look at Richard Thornton, who now knew exactly what kind of man he'd mocked in the parking lot. Someone started clapping again, but David barely heard it. All he could think was that his past had finally caught up with him, and everything was about to change. The applause in the lobby felt surreal to David. He stood there, frozen, as people he'd never met clapped for a version of himself that hadn't existed in 20 years. Sophie tugged on his sleeve, looking up at him with confusion and awe. "Dad, is that true? Were you really famous?" David knelt down to her level, his knees protesting after a long day. "I wasn't famous, sweetheart. I just played piano like you do, a long time ago. But you never told me." "Because it doesn't matter," David said softly. "What matters is you, and how amazing you were tonight." Richard Thornton stood a few feet away, his face cycling through different shades of red and white. His wife had moved closer to him, whispering urgently in his ear, probably telling him they needed to leave. But Thornton seemed rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away. Jonathan Pierce wasn't finished, though. He turned to address the growing crowd of parents and students. David gave up his scholarship to Juilliard when he was 19. His mother had stage 4 cancer, no insurance, and medical bills that would have bankrupted most families. He worked 3 jobs back then too, just like he does now. He was in the hospital with her until the very end, 5 years later. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, adding her own piece to the story. And then 2 years ago, David's wife passed away unexpectedly. He's been raising Sophie alone ever since, working those same multiple jobs to keep her in this academy and pay for her piano lessons. A woman in the crowd gasped. David recognized her as one of the mothers who'd laughed in the parking lot earlier. She looked mortified now. 3 jobs? Another parent asked. "What kind of jobs?" Jonathan looked at David as if asking permission, but then continued anyway. "He cleans offices at Henderson Building from 5 to 8 in the morning, then construction work from 9 to 5, then back to janitorial work from 6 until 10 at night. Every single day, 7 days a week." 7 days? Someone whispered. "How do you even have time to sleep?" Another parent asked. David finally found his voice. "You make time for what matters." Sophie needed to stay in school. She needed her music lessons. Kids need stability, especially after losing their mother. So you do what you have to do. The mother who'd gasped earlier came forward, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. In the parking lot when we laughed, we had no idea." "It's okay," David interrupted, though it wasn't really okay. "You didn't know." "But that's the point," she said. "We should have known better than to judge anyone without knowing their story." Richard Thornton finally spoke up, his voice hoarse. 20 years ago. "You said 20 years ago?" He looked at Jonathan. "I remember hearing about a young pianist, David Williams. There were articles in the classical music magazines. Everyone was talking about him. Then he just disappeared. I never knew what happened." "Now you know," Jonathan said coolly. "He disappeared because he chose family over fame. Not everyone makes that choice." The implication hung in the air. Thornton looked like he'd been slapped. Mrs. Chen moved closer to David, her hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I knew some of your story when I accepted Sophie as a student. The academy administrator mentioned you were working multiple jobs. But I didn't know about Juilliard. I didn't know you were the David Williams until tonight when Jonathan said your name." "You knew about Dad?" Sophie asked her teacher. "I knew your father had some musical background," Mrs. Chen said gently. "When you started lessons, I could tell you'd been taught the fundamentals by someone who really understood music. The way you positioned your hands, the way you approached reading music, that doesn't come from nowhere." David felt exposed, like everyone was seeing parts of him he'd kept hidden for 2 decades. "I just taught her the basics. Everything else is her own talent and hard work." "Don't sell yourself short," Jonathan said. "The way Sophie plays, that emotional depth, she learned that from watching you. Talent is genetic, but artistry is taught." A man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. David didn't recognize him, but he looked important. "Excuse me, Jonathan, I couldn't help but overhear. Did you say you're featuring this young lady in your documentary series?" "I was just about to discuss it with her father," Jonathan replied. "Paul Henderson," the man said, extending his hand to David. "I'm on the board of the Manhattan School of Music." David shook his hand, feeling completely overwhelmed. Manhattan School of Music. That was one of the best music schools in the country. "Sophie's performance tonight was remarkable," Henderson continued. "If Jonathan's documentary includes coverage of her training, I'd like to discuss a full scholarship to our pre-college division. We have a program for exceptionally talented young students." David couldn't speak. "A full scholarship? To Manhattan School of Music?" That kind of training cost tens of thousands of dollars. The scholarship would cover tuition, private lessons, and all materials, Henderson explained. We want to nurture talents like Sophie's. Students like her are why we exist. Sophie grabbed David's hand. Dad, is this real? I think so, honey, David managed to say, his voice shaking. Mrs. Chen was crying again, happy tears this time. Mr. Williams, there's something else. The Academy Board met last week. We've been looking for a new piano instructor. Our previous teacher retired, and we need someone who can really connect with students. Someone who understands both technique and emotion. David looked at her, not understanding what she was saying. We want to offer you the position, Mrs. Chen continued. Full-time with benefits. The salary would be $75,000 a year. The lobby seemed to tilt. $75,000? That was more than double what he made from all three of his current jobs combined. I don't have a teaching degree, David said weakly. You have something better, Mrs. Chen replied. You have experience, talent, and clearly the ability to pass it on. Look at Sophie. You taught her the foundation she built on. We can help you get certified while you teach. The board already approved it. Richard Thornton suddenly stepped forward and the crowd parted to let him through. He looked directly at David, and there was no trace of the smugness from earlier. He looked sick. Mr. Williams, Thornton said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to apologize. What I said in the parking lot was unforgivable. David didn't respond. He just looked at the man who'd humiliated him an hour ago. I judged you without knowing anything about you, Thornton continued. I was cruel, and I did it in front of your daughter and my own. I mocked your car, your job, your life, and all the while you were sacrificing everything for your child. You were being the kind of father I should try to be. Some parents in the crowd nodded. Others looked away, probably remembering their own harsh judgments. I have money, Thornton said. I have success. I have a luxury car and a big house and people who work for me. But watching your daughter play tonight and hearing your story, I realize I don't have what really matters. My daughter plays piano perfectly, but she plays it like a robot. She has every advantage money can buy, but she doesn't have what Sophie has. She doesn't have heart. Victoria, Thornton's daughter, was standing nearby with her mother. She was crying quietly, and David felt a pang of sympathy for her. This wasn't her fault. I want to make this right, Thornton said. I don't know how, but I want to try. David thought about all the things he could say. He thought about how good it would feel to tell this rich man exactly what he thought of him and his cruel jokes. But then he looked at Sophie, who was watching him carefully. And he thought about the example he wanted to set. Mr. Thornton, David said quietly, I accept your apology. Thornton looked surprised, like he'd expected anger or rejection. We all make mistakes, David continued. Big ones sometimes. What matters is whether we learn from them. That's very generous of you, Thornton said. It's not about being generous. It's about understanding that holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. You hurt me tonight, but I'm choosing to let it go. For Sophie's sake, and honestly for my own sake too. Life's too short to carry that weight around. The crowd was silent again, watching this exchange like it was the main performance of the evening. Thornton nodded slowly. My daughter Victoria wants to learn to play with feeling. She told me that after watching Sophie, she's been taking lessons for years, but tonight she realized something was missing. Would you consider teaching her? Once you start at the academy, I mean. I'll pay extra whatever you need. David looked at Victoria, who was wiping her eyes. She looked genuinely moved by Sophie's performance and genuinely embarrassed by her father's behavior. She was just a kid caught in the middle of adult drama. I'll teach her, David said. Not for extra money, though. If I'm teaching at the academy, she'll be my student just like any other student. Every kid deserves a chance to find what music means to them. Thornton's eyes got watery. Thank you. You're a better man than I am. I'm just a dad trying to do right by his kid, David replied. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward again. So, David, what do you say? Documentary series, full scholarship for Sophie to Manhattan School of Music, and you'd be featured teaching her and other students. We'd film over the course of a year. The series is called Keys to the Future, and it focuses on young prodigies and the families who support them. David looked down at Sophie. What do you think, kiddo? This is your life too. Sophie thought for a moment, serious and thoughtful. Will I still get to practice at home with you? Every day, David promised. Then yes, Sophie said. I want to do it, David turned to Jonathan. Then we'll do it. The lobby erupted in applause again. People crowded around to congratulate them, to shake David's hand, to tell Sophie how talented she was. Mrs. Chen was making plans for David's start date at the academy. Henderson was giving him information about the Manhattan School of Music program. Through it all, David kept Sophie close. This was overwhelming, exciting, terrifying, and amazing all at once. A few hours ago, he'd been worried about his car making it to the recital. Now he was being offered opportunities he'd never dreamed possible. As the crowd finally started to thin out, families heading home for the night, Richard Thornton approached one more time. "I meant what I said about being a better father," Thornton told David quietly. "Would you be willing to give me some advice? Not about piano, about being a dad." David looked at this wealthy, powerful man who was humbling himself enough to ask for help. "The only advice I have is simple. Show up, be there, not just physically but really there. Listen to your kid. Put down your phone. Turn off your work brain. Kids don't need perfect parents or expensive things. They need you." Thornton nodded, taking in every word. "Thank you. Truly." As they walked to the parking lot, Sophie chattering excitedly about everything that had happened, David noticed that people looked at his old car differently now. No one was sneering or judging. Some people even smiled at it like it was a symbol of something meaningful. The engine still sputtered when he started it. The mirror was still held on with duct tape. But somehow it didn't seem quite as embarrassing anymore. This car had gotten them here tonight. It had gotten them to every recital practice, every lesson, every important moment. Maybe it wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and it represented every sacrifice he'd made for Sophie. "Dad," Sophie said as they pulled out of the parking lot. "Are you happy?" David thought about the question. Was he happy? He was exhausted. He was overwhelmed. He was still processing everything that had happened. But when he looked at his daughter's face in the rearview mirror, glowing with joy and excitement, he knew the answer. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "I'm happy. Are you?" "I'm so happy I could explode," Sophie said, and they both laughed. As they drove home through the dark streets, David thought about how quickly life could change. This morning he'd been a janitor working 3 jobs, invisible to most of the world. Tonight he was being offered a teaching position. His daughter had a scholarship, and their story was going to be shared with thousands of people. But the most important thing hadn't changed. He was still Sophie's dad. She was still his amazing daughter. And they still had each other. Everything else was just details. The next morning, David woke up at 4:30 like always, his body trained to the routine after years of early shifts. For a moment, lying in the dark, he wondered if last night had been a dream. Then he saw the business cards on his nightstand, Jonathan Pierce and Paul Henderson, proof that it had all really happened. He should have felt excited. Instead, he felt terrified. David went through his morning routine on autopilot, making coffee and packing his lunch. He was halfway out the door to his cleaning job when he stopped. Mrs. Chen had told him to call her this morning to discuss his start date. The academy wanted him to begin in 2 weeks, which meant he needed to give notice at his jobs. The thought of quitting made his stomach hurt. What if something went wrong? What if the teaching position fell through? What if he was making a huge mistake giving up 3 steady paychecks even if they were small, for one job that paid more? The voice in his head sounded a lot like fear, and David had learned to listen to fear over the years. Fear kept you safe. Fear kept you from making stupid decisions. But then he thought about Sophie still asleep in her room, dreaming about whatever 8-year-olds dream about. She deserved a father who wasn't exhausted all the time. She deserved a father who could be at her performances without worrying about rushing off to a night shift. David picked up his phone and called Mrs. Chen. "David," she answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake despite the early hour. "I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about your schedule. How soon can you start?" "That's what I wanted to talk about. I need to give proper notice at my current jobs. 2 weeks seems right." Of course. "But David, I have to tell you something else. After you left last night, several other board members approached me. They want to create a scholarship fund in your name, the David Williams Music Scholarship for talented students from families who couldn't otherwise afford lessons." David sat down heavily on his couch. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Your story touched people. They want to help other kids like Sophie, other parents like you. We're already getting donations. The fund should be substantial enough to support 3 or 4 students to start. After they hung up, David sat in his quiet apartment, the morning sun just starting to filter through the curtains. His phone rang again. It was his supervisor at the construction company. "Hey David, I heard what happened at your daughter's recital last night. News travels fast in this neighborhood. I wanted to tell you congratulations, and also that you don't need to worry about the 2 weeks' notice. We're good. You've been a solid worker, and honestly, you deserve better than hauling concrete at your age." One by one, his employers called that morning. The cleaning company, the construction crew, even the building management at Henderson. Word had spread somehow, probably through the parents at the recital who worked in various places around the city. Everyone was supportive. Everyone understood. By noon, David was officially unemployed for the first time in 20 years, with 2 weeks until his new job started. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Sophie came bouncing out of her room around 8, still in her pajamas. "Dad, you're still home?" "I am. I quit my morning job." Her eyes went wide. "Really? Does that mean you can make me breakfast?" David laughed. When was the last time he'd made her breakfast on a weekday? Usually Sophie got herself cereal before school while David was already at his first job. "Yeah, kiddo. I can make you breakfast. What do you want?" "Pancakes," she shouted, jumping up and down. So David made pancakes and they ate together at the kitchen table like a normal family. Sophie told him about a book she was reading, about her friend at school who had a pet hamster, about how she wanted to name her first piano composition. David listened to every word, realizing how much he'd been missing during those rushed mornings. "Dad?" Sophie said, syrup on her chin. "Are you scared?" "About what?" "About everything changing." David wiped her chin with a napkin. "Yeah, I'm scared. Change is scary even when it's good change. But you're still going to do it, right? The teaching job and everything?" "I'm still going to do it," David confirmed. Sometimes being brave means doing things even when you're scared. Over the next 2 weeks, David's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jonathan Pierce came by with a film crew to do preliminary interviews and set up the documentary schedule. They'd start filming in a month, giving Sophie time to begin her program at Manhattan School of Music first. Paul Henderson took them on a tour of the music school. The facilities were incredible. Practice rooms with beautiful grand pianos, a concert hall with perfect acoustics, teachers who'd performed with major orchestras around the world. Sophie was wide-eyed the whole time, touching everything like she was afraid it might disappear. "She'll fit right in," Henderson assured David. "We have students from all kinds of backgrounds. Talent doesn't care about money or status." David met with Mrs. Chen several times to prepare for his teaching role. She showed him the curriculum, introduced him to the other teachers, walked him through the academy's expectations. The other instructors welcomed him warmly. One of them, an elderly violin teacher named Mr. Kowalski, pulled him aside. "I heard your story," Mr. Kowalski said in his thick accent. "I came to America with nothing, worked in factories while playing violin at night. It took me 30 years to get where I am. You inspire me because you never stopped being a musician, even when you had to put it aside. That's the mark of a true artist." David met his first students before officially starting. Victoria Thornton was one of them, nervous and eager to please. She came to his apartment one afternoon with her father for an introductory lesson. "I want to learn to play like your daughter," Victoria said quietly. "I want people to feel something when I play." David sat beside her at Sophie's keyboard. "Then we're going to start from the beginning. Not with technique, with why. Why do you want to play piano?" Victoria thought about it. "Because it's beautiful. Because when Sophie played, I felt something in my chest, like my heart was expanding. I never felt that before, even though I've been playing for years." "Good," David said. "Hold on to that feeling. That's what we're chasing." Richard Thornton watched from the doorway, and David caught him wiping his eyes at one point. After the lesson, Thornton pulled David aside. "Can I ask you something personal?" Thornton said. "How do you not hate me?" "After what I did?" David leaned against the wall, tired but honest. "I don't hate you because hate takes energy I don't have. I've got a daughter to raise and a new life to build. Plus, I've learned that everyone's fighting battles you can't see. Maybe you were having a bad day. Maybe you've got your own struggles. Doesn't excuse what you said, but it helps me understand it." "I was showing off," Thornton admitted. "I saw your car and I wanted to feel superior. I wanted the other parents to see me putting someone down because it made me feel powerful. It was pathetic. Yeah, it was, David agreed. But you're here now, trying to do better. That counts for something. The day before David's first official day at the academy, he did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He went to a piano store and played. The salesman recognized him somehow, maybe from news coverage of the recital that had ended up in the local paper. "Mr. Williams, please try any piano you'd like." David sat at a beautiful grand piano, his hands hovering over the keys. He was rusty. He was out of practice. But when he started playing, something inside him unlocked. It was like coming home after a long journey. He played for an hour, working through pieces he'd thought he'd forgotten. His fingers remembered what his mind had pushed aside. Other customers in the store stopped to listen. The salesman stood in the corner with tears running down his face. When David finally stopped, his hands shaking slightly, the small crowd applauded. He felt embarrassed but also alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I can't afford any of these," David told the salesman quietly. "I know," the man replied, "but you needed to play, and we needed to hear it. Consider it a gift." On his first day at Westbrook Academy, David wore khakis and a button-down shirt that Sophie had helped him pick out. She'd chosen a blue tie because blue is lucky, Dad. His first class was a group of beginners, 6 students ranging from age 7 to 10. They stared at him with wide eyes, probably having heard stories about the famous teacher who used to be a janitor. "Hi, everyone," David said, sitting at the piano in the bright, sunny classroom. "I'm Mr. Williams. Before we start, I want to tell you something important. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about expressing yourself. Some of you might become professional musicians. Others might just play for fun your whole lives. Both are equally valid. The only thing that matters is that you find joy in it." One little girl raised her hand. "Is it true you were going to be famous?" "I was going to try," David answered honestly. But life had different plans. And you know what? I'm okay with that. Because if I'd become famous, I wouldn't have my daughter. I wouldn't be here teaching you. Everything happens for a reason. The days fell into a rhythm. David taught from 9 to 5 at the academy. He came home to Sophie, who was thriving in her program at Manhattan School of Music. They practiced together in the evenings, and David found himself improving alongside her. The rust was wearing off, and the pianist he used to be was emerging again, older and wiser. Sophie's documentary filming started, and cameras followed them through their daily lives. It was awkward at first, having someone film you making dinner or helping with homework, but Jonathan Pierce had a gentle way of making them forget the cameras were there. "Tell me about the day you decided to give up Juilliard," Jonathan asked one evening during a filmed interview. David thought back to that horrible day, sitting in the hospital with his mother, the letter from Juilliard on his lap. It wasn't really a decision. It was the only choice. My mother needed me. She'd sacrificed so much to help me get that far. How could I abandon her when she needed me most? Do you regret it? I regret that she had to suffer. I regret that she died. But giving up Juilliard? No, I don't regret that. I got 5 more years with my mother. I was there when she passed. She told me she was proud of me. That's worth more than any concert hall. The documentary caught Sophie's first performance at the Manhattan School of Music, a small recital for new students. She was nervous, but when she played, that same magic from Westbrook Academy filled the room. Other students' parents approached David afterward, asking if he took private students. "I do," David found himself saying. "But I work with students who really want to learn, not just check a box. And I don't care about your background or how much money you have. Talent and dedication are all that matter." Word spread quickly. Within a month, David had a waiting list of students wanting to learn from him. Some were wealthy kids whose parents could pay premium rates. Others were scholarship students who couldn't pay at all. David treated them all the same, pushing them to dig deeper, to find the emotion behind the notes. Victoria Thornton blossomed under his teaching. She'd never be a virtuoso like Sophie, but she learned to play with feeling. Her father came to every lesson, watching quietly from the back of the room, taking notes on how David interacted with his daughter. "You're patient," Thornton observed once. "I would have given up on her by now. She's missed notes 3 times in that section." "She's not missing notes," David corrected. "She's learning. Every mistake is a step toward getting it right." If I yelled at her or made her feel bad, she'd just get tense and make more mistakes. But if I help her understand why she's struggling, She can work through it. I yell at my employees all the time, Thornton admitted. Maybe that's something to think about changing. 3 months into his new life, David received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check for $15,000 and a note from the Academy Board. First quarter proceeds from the David Williams Music Scholarship Fund. This will cover 3 full scholarships for the next school year. Because of your example, 6 other donors have committed to annual contributions. David stared at the check, then at the list of scholarship recipients. One was a kid from the neighborhood where he used to do construction work. Another was a girl whose single mother worked 2 jobs. The third was a boy who'd been living in foster care. Sophie looked at the list over his shoulder. Dad, you're helping them like Mrs. Chen helped us. I guess I am, David said, his voice thick with emotion. That night after Sophie went to bed, David sat at the keyboard they still kept in the living room. He started playing, and for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't playing someone else's composition. He was creating something new, something that came from his own heart. The melody was simple but beautiful, full of the sadness of loss and the joy of unexpected blessings. He played until his hands hurt, then grabbed a piece of paper and started writing down the notes, not wanting to forget. This was his first original composition in 2 decades. He titled it Sophie's Song, and knew that someday when she was ready he'd teach it to her. It would be his gift to her, his way of saying thank you for giving him a reason to keep going when everything else felt impossible. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jonathan Pierce. David, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're going to premiere the first episode of Keys to the Future next month. It focuses on you and Sophie. The network is very excited about it. They think it's going to be big. Big how? David asked nervously. Viral big. Everyone loves an underdog story, and yours is incredible. You should prepare yourself for some attention. After hanging up, David looked around his small apartment. The furniture was still secondhand. The walls still needed paint. But it was home, and it was filled with music and love. That was enough. Or at least he hoped it would be enough when the world started watching. The documentary premiered on a Thursday evening in November, exactly 6 months after that life-changing recital. David and Sophie watched it together on their small television, Sophie eating popcorn and David too nervous to eat anything. Seeing their lives played out on screen was surreal. There was footage of David teaching at the academy, Sophie practicing at Manhattan School of Music, and interviews where they talked about loss and dreams and never giving up. The producers had even found old footage of David playing piano when he was 19. A bright-eyed kid full of confidence and talent. You looked so young, Dad, Sophie said, laughing at his old haircut. The episode showed Richard Thornton, too, talking about his mistakes and what he'd learned. I saw a man in a parking lot and decided he wasn't worth my respect because of his car and his job. I was completely wrong. David Williams is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, and I almost missed knowing him because I was too busy being arrogant. When the episode ended with Sophie performing at her first major recital at Manhattan School of Music, both David and Sophie were crying. It was beautifully done, honest and emotional without being manipulative. David's phone started ringing immediately. Then it didn't stop. By Friday morning, the episode had been viewed over 2 million times online. Social media was flooded with comments about their story. People were calling David inspirational, a hero, the father of the Yi.